On the morning of January 12, 1943, in Waterloo, Iowa, 3 Navy men came to the Sullivan house with news from the South Pacific. Thomas Sullivan, an Illinois Central freight conductor, had 5 sons in the Navy and one question at the door. Family memory preserves it as 2 words, which one? The answer was shorter than a telegram and worse than any telegram. All 5. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan had served together on USS Juneau. Their ship had vanished off Guadalcanal 60 days earlier, and the Navy had finally come home. The official story was simple enough to fit a poster. 5 brothers from one Iowa family had gone to sea together and died together. The true story was messier. USS Juneau did not merely sink. She was torn apart by a magazine explosion after a Japanese submarine torpedo hit her already damaged hull on November 13, 1942. Around 100 to 140 men may have reached the water. Only 10 were rescued. 3 mysteries carry the story. Why were 5 brothers allowed aboard one cruiser? Why did rescue take days? And why did policy change only after the family was already gone? Watch The Friend Who Died First, William V, Ball on USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Watch Captain Gilbert Hoover on USS Helena when Juneau disappears behind smoke. Watch Alan Hayne in the water, because his memory preserved the last known hours of George Sullivan. And watch Alleta Sullivan after the notification, when the Office of War Information turned a mother of 5 dead sailors into a public speaker asking strangers, "What have you given to win this war?" The Navy did not only lose 5 brothers. It learned how dangerous a symbol can become. Waterloo was not a coastal city. It was a working Midwestern manufacturing town on the Cedar River, with rail yards, packing plants, churches, schools, and neighborhoods where families knew who had gone into uniform. The National Park Service notes that Waterloo sent about 8,100 citizens into military service during World War II, and at least 225 did not return. The Sullivan family lived inside that larger homefront story. Their loss became famous because 5 brothers died at once, but Waterloo's wartime burden was not limited to one house. The city was already giving sons, labor, steel, meat, and sleep. Thomas and Alleta Sullivan had 6 children, 5 sons and a daughter, Genevieve. The sons were George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert. Official Navy material gives their ages at death as 28, 27, 24, 23, and 20. They were Irish Catholic, loud, close, physical, and remembered locally as a pack more than a line of separate men. Before enlistment, they worked ordinary jobs, including at Rath Packing Company. Their later fame can make them look pre-selected for legend. In 1941, they were young working men from Waterloo with one younger sister and one very tight family. George and Francis had already served in the Navy before Pearl Harbor. They enlisted on May 11, 1937, and served aboard USS Hovey before returning to civilian life. Their younger brothers had not followed them yet. Albert, the youngest, was married to Catherine Roof and had a baby son, James, known as Jimmy. That detail matters because Albert was not only someone's brother. He was a husband and father. The public phrase, 5 brothers can hide a 6th life in the room, a child too young to remember the man whose surname he would later carry. Pearl Harbor changed the family conversation. William V, Ball, a friend of the Sullivans, was killed aboard USS Arizona on December 7, 1941. NPS material identifies Ball's death as the event the brothers promised to avenge when they entered the Navy in January 1942. The story has often been told as pure revenge, but it was also familiarity. George and Frank knew the Navy. The others knew George and Frank. The 5 had grown up doing things together, and war gave that habit a uniform. Their condition was blunt: if they went together. On January 3, 1942, the brothers went to enlist. Naval History and Heritage Command material states that George and Francis re-enlisted with Joseph, Madison, and Albert so they could serve together. The Navy already preferred to separate family members, but that preference was not absolute and not consistently enforced. The Sullivans insisted. They were not the only siblings to serve together in the war, and Juneau was not the only ship with brothers aboard. What made the Sullivans different was not the request. It was the scale of what happened after the request was granted. The ship they joined was USS Juneau, CL-52, an Atlanta-class light cruiser commissioned in February 1942. She was built for speed and anti-aircraft fire, armed with dual-purpose 5-inch guns and designed to screen larger ships against aircraft and destroyers. The brothers were photographed aboard her at commissioning, standing in uniform from left to right: Joseph, Francis, Albert, Madison, and George. That photograph became one of the most reproduced family images of the American War. At the time, it was simply 5 sailors on a new ship, looking young because they were. Juneau's war was short. She initially served in the Atlantic, then moved to the Pacific in August 1942. By autumn she was drawn into the Guadalcanal campaign, where the U.S. Navy fought night battles in confined waters against Japanese surface forces trying to crush the Marine foothold on the island. The stretch of water north of Guadalcanal would later be called Iron Bottom Sound because so many ships went down there. For Juneau, Guadalcanal meant anti-aircraft duty, surface action, torpedo danger, and little sleep. For the Sullivans, it meant the family promise was now inside a lethal campaign. The naval battle of Guadalcanal began for Juneau in the early hours of November 13, 1942. American and Japanese ships collided in darkness at close range. Searchlights, shells, torpedoes, wakes, fires, and mistaken identities turned the battle into a violent confusion. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were killed. The cruiser USS Atlanta was crippled. Destroyers burned. Juneau was hit by a torpedo during the night action and badly damaged, down by the bow and struggling to keep station. She survived the first blow. That survival would become the cruelest part of the story. After dawn, a damaged American group withdrew south. Juneau was with USS San Francisco, USS Helena, and other battered ships trying to get away from the battle area. Captain Lyman Swenson of Juneau was still aboard. Captain Gilbert C. Hoover of Helena had become the senior officer present among the surviving ships. The sea was calm enough to make Juneau's injury visible. She was slow, damaged, and vulnerable. The group feared submarines. That fear was not imaginary. Japanese submarine I-26 was in the area, and its commander had a firing position. At about 11 o'clock in the morning on November 13, I-26 fired torpedoes toward the American column. The intended target was not necessarily Juneau, but one torpedo found her. It struck near the damaged forward area and detonated the cruiser's magazines. Naval history accounts describe the explosion as catastrophic. The ship broke apart and disappeared in about 42 seconds. A light cruiser more than 500 feet long became smoke, flame, oil, steel fragments, and men thrown into open water. Most of the crew died in the blast. The 5 Sullivan brothers were now separated in the most permanent way possible. Later accounts differ in the details of the brothers' final minutes, and that uncertainty should not be smoothed over. Naval history material states that 4 brothers failed to make it topside and that George, wounded, reached a raft but died later. The National World War II Museum notes survivor testimony that Albert may also have lived briefly after the explosion before dying of wounds. In either version, the outcome is the same. The family promised to stay together had met a magazine explosion. The ocean did not preserve clean paperwork. It preserved fragments, survivors' memories, and questions. On Helena, Captain Hoover faced one of the ugliest decisions in the Pacific War. He had seen Juneau vanish. He believed, wrongly, that nobody could have survived the explosion. He also feared the submarine that had just fired, and reports suggested more submarines might be nearby. Stopping a damaged column to search could risk more ships. Continuing south could abandon men in the water. Hoover continued. He did signal an aircraft to report the position, but no immediate rescue reached the survivors. The decision would follow him for the rest of his career. The men in the water knew nothing about command reasoning. They knew oil in their eyes, burns, wounds, thirst, sharks, floating debris, and a horizon without ships. The National World War II Museum quotes survivor Frank Holmgren recalling, "The ship just blew up in my face." Holmgren found a life jacket as the fantail rose. Alan Hayne grabbed debris and reached life rings tied to rafts. Some survivors were too injured to help themselves. Others tried to organize rafts and floats. The first hour after Juneau's sinking may have held more than 100 living men. The ocean began reducing that number immediately. AB-17 flew over roughly an hour later. Survivors saw the aircraft, waved, and believed rescue would follow. The report did not produce the immediate search they needed. Days passed. Wounded men died. Salt water drove some men into delirium. Sharks took others. The National World War II Museum describes the survivors hearing screams and seeing water thrash before silence returned. A naval disaster usually ends when the ship sinks. Juneau's disaster continued for days after the ship was gone. That is the buried part of the story the wartime posters did not show. George Sullivan's last days are known mainly through survivor Alan Hayne. Hayne recalled sharing a raft with George, who called out for his brothers and slowly lost touch under shock, grief, thirst, and saltwater exposure. For days after the sinking, according to Hayne's account summarized by the National World War II Museum, George stripped off his clothes and said he was going below to take a bath. He swam away and disappeared. That line is almost too strange to bear, but delirium often sounds strange from a distance. George was not choosing death clearly. He was dying in pieces. Only 10 Juneau sailors were rescued. The destroyer USS Ballard found survivors 9 days after the sinking, including Alan Hayne, who by then was the sole survivor on his raft. The number 10 is one of the coldest facts in the story. It means the great majority of those who survived the explosion died afterward. They died not in the instant that made the posters, but in the waiting. Juneau's loss was therefore two disasters, a ship destroyed in 42 seconds, and a rescue failure measured in days. The Navy did not immediately tell the public what had happened. Wartime secrecy around ship losses was normal, especially in a campaign as contested as Guadalcanal. But secrecy had a human consequence in Waterloo. Letters stopped. Rumors moved faster than official confirmation. Alleta Sullivan wrote to the Bureau of Naval Personnel asking about her sons after hearing reports that Juneau had been lost. The National Archives preserves her letter and Roosevelt's reply. The family was not passively waiting for history to inform them. They were already searching through silence. The notification on January 12, 1943, did not end uncertainty in the bureaucratic sense. The brothers were initially listed as missing in action, a category both merciful and cruel. Missing leaves a small space where hope can hide. It also prevents mourning from completing its first motion. Newspapers on January 13 carried the story nationally. Nara notes that the Washington Post reported the brothers as missing after their ship sank on November 13. The country learned their names quickly. Their parents had to learn how to live with a phrase that did not contain bodies. The Roosevelt letter gave the grief a presidential signature, but not a full answer. In his January 13, 1943 reply to Alleta Sullivan, Franklin Roosevelt wrote that the nation shared her sorrow and that her sons had given their lives in service. The phrasing was formal, careful, and unmistakably official. It also shows how quickly private loss had become national material. A mother asked a specific question about 5 boys from Waterloo. The answer came from the White House. Between those 2 points sat a cruiser nobody could raise, a casualty report nobody wanted to deliver, and a silence no letter could repair. The Sullivans became national symbols almost immediately. NPS material describes how the military used newsreels, photographs, and stories of the family to mobilize the home front. The Office of War Information poster carried their photograph and the line, "They did their part." The phrase was effective because it was simple. It was also incomplete. It did not mention that most Juneau survivors died after the blast, or that the Navy had allowed a family concentration it already knew was risky. Public memory had selected one frame, 5 faces, 1 family, total loss. The photograph most Americans remember was taken aboard USS Juneau at New York Navy Yard on February 14, 1942, the day the cruiser was commissioned. The brothers stand shoulder to shoulder in uniform, Joseph, Francis, Albert, Madison, and George. The image is almost too orderly. 5 sailors. Clean blues. Straight backs. No ocean in sight. That is why it became so reusable. It showed a family before the blast, before the rafts, before the January telegram. The camera made them easy to mourn because it froze them at the exact point before history broke the frame. Thomas and Alleta Sullivan did something that still feels hard to read. They went on radio and public appearances to support the war effort after losing every son. In a February 1, 1943 Waterloo Courier account preserved by NPS, Tom Sullivan asked the country, "What have you given to win this war?" Alleta said the boys had gone together because that was the way they wanted it to be. Those lines were sincere, but they were also used by a government that needed production, bonds, enlistments, and morale. The family grieved in public because the war asked them to. Genevieve Sullivan, the only sister, sat at home listening as her parents spoke to the nation. The NPS account says tears rolled down her cheeks during the broadcast. She later joined the Navy Waves, turning private family loss into direct service. That choice can be read many ways: loyalty, pressure, grief, duty, anger, or all of them at once. The Sullivan story often centers the five brothers so tightly that Genevieve becomes an afterthought. She should not be. She was the surviving child inside a family suddenly known for having no surviving sons. The Navy moved quickly to create a memorial in steel. President Franklin Roosevelt approved naming a Fletcher-class destroyer USS the Sullivans, DD 537. Alleta Sullivan christened the ship when she launched on April 4, 1943. The destroyer was commissioned on September 30, 1943. Her motto became, "We stick together." That motto had emotional force because it sounded like the brothers' own condition for enlistment. It also carried an irony too heavy for ceremony. Sticking together had been the source of their meaning and the source of the family's total loss. USS the Sullivans DD 537 fought in the Pacific, earned battle stars in World War II, later served in Korea, and eventually became a museum ship in Buffalo, New York. The ship's survival gave the family name a hull, a deck, a bell, and a place visitors could board. That mattered because the Juneau wreck lay unseen for decades. A memorial ship is not a grave, but it gives sailors and civilians something to touch. In the Sullivan case, the Navy built a vessel to carry a name because the ocean had kept the bodies. The first Hollywood version arrived while the war was still going. The 1944 film The Fighting Sullivans turned the family into a homefront drama, with childhood scenes, enlistment, brotherly loyalty, and a grief the audience could survive in 2 hours. The film helped fix the public version: warm family, united brothers, noble loss. What it could not show in full was the oil, thirst, sharks, delayed rescue, and command controversy. Wartime films are often asked to console before they are asked to clarify. The Fighting Sullivans did what 1944 needed. History has to do more. After the war, confusion grew around policy. Many people later spoke of a Sullivan Act that supposedly forbade siblings from serving together. Naval History and Heritage Command calls that a misconception. No such act of Congress or presidential order banned family members from the same ship. What did happen was more layered. Navy policy discouraged such assignments, wartime circular letters addressed sole survivors, and later Department of Defense survivorship policies developed. The myth is understandable because people wanted a clean rule after a messy tragedy. But the actual record is bureaucratic, gradual, and less satisfying. The Navy's own paperwork began moving before the public myth hardened. Naval History and Heritage Command lists a 1942 Bureau of Naval Personnel bulletin on assigning brothers to the same ship or station, then Circular Letter 345-44, issued on November 15, 1944, on sole survivor policy. Those documents are dry by design. They do not sound like Waterloo, or Juneau, or a mother at a door. But dry language is often where grief becomes procedure. The danger becomes a paragraph. The paragraph becomes guidance. The guidance becomes the thing future families never see because someone in uniform says no. The term sole survivor policy is real, but it is often simplified. NPS links the Sullivan story to Department of Defense Directive 1315.15, and later federal and service policies protected sole surviving sons or daughters in defined circumstances. The policy did not simply say brothers could never serve together. Even modern Navy guidance allows family co-location under conditions. The lesson of the Sullivans became not a total ban but a warning: family concentration carries risk that commanders, recruiters, and families must acknowledge before sentiment turns into casualty arithmetic. The later draft exemption was narrower than legend. In 1948, Section 6(o) of the Military Selective Service Act protected a sole surviving son from induction when a brother or sister had died through military service. That was not the same thing as forbidding every pair of siblings from serving together. It was a legal protection for a specific family situation, written after years of wartime cases made the risk impossible to ignore. The difference matters for storytelling. A myth says the Sullivans caused one simple lull. The real record says they helped force a slow system to recognize a category of loss. Captain Hoover's decision remained a separate wound. He had reasons: submarines, damaged ships, exhaustion, and a reasonable belief that Juneau had been annihilated. He also left living men in the water. US&I discussions of the episode make clear that naval historians still debate whether he was right, wrong, or trapped by the facts available to him. Halsey later relieved him. The moral difficulty is that both sides of the decision contain truth. Stopping might have risked more ships. Continuing cost almost every Juneau survivor. Command sometimes means choosing which future guilt to carry. Juneau's wreck was found on March 17, 2018, by the research vessel Petrel, funded by Paul Allen's team. The National World War II Museum describes the wreck lying about 13,000 feet below the surface, scattered across a wide debris field. Her stern still carried the raised name Juneau. That discovery mattered because it changed the ship from an absence into an image again. The brothers' final resting place was no longer only a coordinate in old reports. It was twisted steel on the floor of the Pacific, still holding the violence of 1942 in its shape. The wreck also restored attention to the rest of the crew. Juneau carried around 700 men, and more than 600 died. The Sullivans became the famous loss, but they were surrounded by other sons, husbands, brothers, fathers, and friends whose names did not become a national shorthand. Nara stresses that the archives hold records of both the Sullivans and their shipmates. That distinction matters. A family story can bring people into history, but a ship is a community too. Juneau's casualty list was not 5+ background. It was hundreds, with 5 at its center. The archival record is more fragmented than the public story. A National Archives curator explained in 2018 that researchers pieced Juneau together from action reports, war damage reports, casualty files, and sometimes deck logs. That matters because no single document saw the whole disaster. The ship's destruction lasted less than a minute. The survivors' ordeal lasted more than a week. The family's notification unfolded over months. Each file captures only a slice. Put together, they show why easy versions fail. The Sullivan story is not one event, but a chain of decisions, delays, paperwork, and memory. The second USS the Sullivans, DDG-68, was commissioned on April 19, 1997. Her official Navy history states that she was christened and sponsored by Kelly and Sullivan, Albert's granddaughter, and named to honor the brothers from Waterloo. Her motto also carries, "We stick together." That continuity links 3 generations: 5 brothers who died, a son and granddaughter who inherited the name, and sailors who serve on a modern destroyer under a family story they are expected to know. A ship's name is not decoration in the Navy. It is instruction. Kelly Sullivan Luffren became one of the keepers of that instruction. NPS reproduces her 2023 reflection explaining that, as ship sponsor, one of her jobs is to teach DDG-68 sailors about the Sullivan brothers and Waterloo's role in World War II. That is a different kind of inheritance from a pension, photograph, or folded flag. She inherited a responsibility to repeat the story accurately enough that sailors understand both pride and warning. The modern crew does not simply carry 5 names. It carries the memory of a choice the Navy would rather not repeat blindly. Waterloo has preserved the story in civic space. The Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum, part of the Grout Museum District, honors Iowa veterans and holds the brothers near the center of a larger state military memory. The city also has places named for them, including memorial spaces and public markers. Those places matter because national fame fades unevenly. A Hollywood film ages. A poster yellows. A policy changes names. A local museum keeps opening its doors. Memory often survives because somebody in the hometown still unlocks the room, turns on the lights, and tells the next group. The parents' later lives were shaped by a public grief almost no family could manage cleanly. Thomas returned to railroad work. Alleta continued appearing at war-related events. Their loss was repeatedly asked to serve national morale. That does not mean their public words were false. It means the country needed them to be useful while they were mourning. The distinction is uncomfortable. The Sullivan parents were both bereaved people and wartime symbols. A symbol can be honored, displayed, and quoted. A bereaved parent still has to wake up in a house where 5 sons no longer make noise. Albert's son Jimmy Sullivan carried the most direct personal inheritance. He was a toddler in 1942 when his father died, too young to remember Albert as a living man. Later accounts record that he served in the Navy himself and remained connected to the ships that bore the family name. That life illustrates the strange afterlife of wartime loss. A child can grow up inside a story large enough for strangers to know before he does. Jimmy inherited not only a missing father, but a national narrative about 5 uncles and a cruiser at Guadalcanal. The survivor accounts also complicate the idea of clean heroism. Alan Hayne, Frank Holmgren, Lester Zook, and the other rescued men returned with memories that did not fit smoothly into posters. Holmgren's line, "The ship just blew up in my face," is not a slogan. It is trauma speaking plainly. Hayne's memory of George calling for his brothers is not a recruiting image. It is a man dissolving under grief and dehydration. The home front needed usable meaning. The survivors carried unusable detail. Both became part of the same national story, but not equally. There is a reason USS Juneau is often compared to USS Indianapolis. Both stories involve a ship destroyed, men left in the water, sharks, delayed rescue, and later controversy over command and notification. But Juneau's case has a distinct family center. The Indianapolis disaster became a story about a crew and a captain. Juneau became, unfairly but inevitably, the story of 5 brothers. The comparison helps because it shows a pattern: naval catastrophe does not end at sinking. It continues through reporting failures, search delays, survivors' testimony, and the way a nation chooses one symbol from many dead. The Sullivans' case also intersects with the Nyland brothers, Borgstrom brothers, and other families whose multiple losses shaped policy discussions. The NPS lesson connects the Sullivan story to survivorship rules, while policy historians warn against the fictional Sullivan Act. That tension is useful. It reminds us that tragedy rarely produces one clean legal answer overnight. First comes shock. Then publicity. Then exceptions. Then memoranda. Then service regulations. Then popular misunderstanding. By the time people say, there is a law, the actual paper trail is usually longer, narrower, and more human. Other families made the policy pressure harder to dismiss. The Borgstrom family of Utah lost 4 sons in 1944. The Nyland family of New York had 2 brothers killed, 1 missing and believed dead, and 1 pulled from combat service. These cases did not duplicate the Sullivans, but they showed the same institutional problem from different angles. A military built around units, orders, and manpower quotas kept colliding with a civilian truth: a family is also a unit. When too many names from one house appear on casualty lists, policy stops being abstract. The phrase, "we stick together," remains the emotional center of the story. It was a family attitude, a ship motto, a memorial line, and a warning. At one level, it means loyalty. At another, it names the danger of confusing love with assignment policy. The brothers wanted to stay together. The Navy allowed it. The result became the greatest single-family combat loss in American military history. None of those statements cancels another. Love was real. Consent was real. Risk was real. The disaster was real. The policy lesson came too late for the people who paid for it. By 2026, the story is still taught to sailors, visitors, students, and military families. It is not an obscure footnote. But familiarity can dull the edge. 5 brothers died sounds like a finished sentence. It is not. It contains a damaged cruiser, a submarine attack, a command decision, rafts, sharks, delayed notification, propaganda, policy confusion, museum work, and a modern destroyer still carrying the name. The Sullivan story survives because it has 2 shapes at once. It is intimate enough for a doorway and large enough for a navy. The deepest question is not whether the brothers should have been allowed to serve together. Hindsight can answer that too easily. The harder question is how institutions handle requests made from loyalty when the risk is obvious but not yet unbearable. In January 1942, the brothers' insistence looked like devotion, resolve, and family unity. In January 1943, the same insistence looked like a catastrophic administrative permission. Institutions often learn only when the cost becomes visible. The Sullivans made that cost visible in a single house, on a single morning, behind one open door. So here is the question the Sullivan brothers leave us with. When 5 sons ask to serve on one ship because staying together is the way they understand loyalty, and a country at war says yes, who owns the consequence when the ocean answers all at once? Is it the brothers, the Navy, the family, the policy that did not yet exist, or the later nation that turned their faces into a lesson while 10 Juneau survivors carried the rest of the story home, still carrying names the posters never had room to print?